Thank you very much. So this was originally a 45-minute presentation. I trimmed it down some in order to get it into the time frame that we have. I am going to go relatively fast. I doubt we'll have time for questions at the end, but I will go outside if we do, and I'd be glad to take questions there if nothing else. How many folks have heard of user testing? Ooh, pretty good. Okay, how many have used the service? Okay, okay, interesting. So for those of you who haven't, I should give a little bit of background just so that you'll know where this information comes from. So user testing is a service that lets you get quick feedback from users on a website or a mobile app. So the users video themselves using your site or your app. They talk about what they're doing, so you specify the tasks you want them to do. They talk about what they're doing. You see video of them using the screen and also hear them talking about it, and we turn it around pretty quickly. In a lot of cases, in less than an hour. In most cases, you get feedback in less than a day. So it's a great way for settling disputes in the team when people are arguing about which widget you should use for something, or for just getting general feedback on the stuff that you're doing. So I joined the company about 9 months ago to drive mobile strategy. And the first thing I did was go through the big archive that we've got of thousands and thousands of mobile tests to try to see are some places where companies are tending to get stuck on a consistent basis. And sure enough, we found that there were, and that's what this presentation is about today. So I'll be talking about that data. The other piece of background you should know, just to know where I'm coming from, is I have been in the industry for a while. I was a developer for a while. I worked at Apple for 10 years, Palm for 6 years, so I was in mobile before we had smartphones. So what you're going to hear today is a combination of what we saw in the research and then kind of my interpretation of what it means based on having dealt with developers for a long time. So to summarize before I get into the details, new computing paradigms are usually a crippling event for the current leaders in any form of computing. And mobile is a new paradigm. In fact, it's a couple of different paradigms, one for smartphones and one for tablets, with subtle and interesting differences between them. There are 4 places where people are tending to get stuck in this transition in terms of designing apps and websites. Mobile basically requires a different set of reflexes in terms of how you design and the types of best practices you go after. If you don't acknowledge that it requires a different set of practices, you will end up screwing up on things because your reflexes will be wrong. So I'll talk about all of that, and then at the end I'll give you 10 steps to try to be successful. So first I'm going to talk about why those transitions are dangerous, then I'll talk about the 4 traps, and then how to avoid them. Anybody know what this is? Shout it out. Physical. Okay, DOS a little bit. This is Lotus 123. So in its day, it was the most successful application for personal computers. And it's hard today for folks to understand exactly how big a deal it was. If you took Google and Facebook and combined them together and then threw in Adobe and a few other companies, you'd start to get an idea of how powerful this company was. And yet, when we went from the command line interface to the graphical interface, Lotus 123 failed utterly to make the transition. Despite the fact that they had the most money and the most engineers and everything else, they did not manage to replicate their success in the new paradigm of computing. This is not an isolated situation. In fact, it has happened over and over again consistently as computing has evolved. So for instance, all of the leaders in the old command line MS-DOS world were not successful in the transition to Windows. It was WordPerfect and word processing and Lotus and spreadsheet and DBase and database. But it didn't just happen that time. Go forward a few years from that, and we got the situation where we had a bunch of companies that were the leaders in software in the graphical interface space. So people like Microsoft and Adobe and Autodesk and et cetera. You go and look at the companies that are the leaders today in web traffic, and they are not the same companies. Now, it's not that the old guys were completely extinguished, but they did not manage to take their existing strength in computer graphical interface software and translate that into equivalent strength in the web world. So there was something about the transition that caused them not to be successful. Now we're going to mobile. It's very, very early in the mobile transition. It's hard to say exactly who the winners are going to be. But if you look at the most developed category in mobile applications, it's probably games. And if you look at the leading game production companies in mobile, they are not the existing PC game companies. They are small shops that have set up for doing mobile. In a lot of cases, they're being bought up by the large companies that are publishing those games. But in terms of who's actually creating those games, it's usually people who started out with mobile and did mobile right from the start, rather than existing folks who'd been doing it on other platforms. So, not sure if this is going to be another extinction event for software companies in general, but it certainly looks like that sort of risk is there. So why does this happen? The first reason is when you get a shift in these platforms, the users reconsider their commitments to existing software. So think about it. If you've got a Windows computer today and you buy a new Windows computer, you're probably just going to use the same apps on it. You know, let me go get Office, let me get the new version of Outlook or something like that. However, think about when you got your first smartphone. What you probably did not do is go out and say, okay, let me get Office for this. Instead, you went to the App Store, if you're like most people, and you looked around and you said, ooh, let me see what's here. Let me try this and let me try that. Very, very normal. That's what most users do. It's kind of like prairie dogs, popping their heads up and looking around and trying to find something new. So the first thing that happens when you got a new paradigm is that people weaken their bonds to the existing standards that they've been using in the past. Second thing that happens is that the rules of good product design change. And I'm going to talk about this one a lot. Basically, when you get one of these paradigm changes, what makes you successful in the old software world usually makes you unsuccessful in the new software world. That's what happened to Lotus. They said, oh, this graphical interface thing, this is going to be easy. We'll just take all our command line stuff and we'll just turn every one of the commands into a different menu command and we're done. No problem at all. Didn't work out. Third problem is that the leaders usually underestimate the challenge. So by the time they realize that they're in trouble, the other guys have gotten so much momentum established that it's too late for them to make the changes that they need to. So your customers become less loyal. You need to remake the way you design stuff. And by the way, you're not going to realize how much of a problem it is. It is a recipe for companies to get themselves into very big trouble, and that's what's happened repeatedly. So that's why these transitions are dangerous. Let me talk about where we see companies getting stuck in this transition today. The first one is mismanagement of their legacy. So if you have an existing website that's really successful in the computer world, or if you have an existing app, in a lot of cases what you tend to want to do is you say, let me just port this across. That's the engineering term. We'll just port this over to mobile and we'll be there. And companies run into all sorts of problems there. We see a lot of usage flow that's driven by the computer version of stuff. So they just take this is the way people use our computer website, and we'll just translate that across to mobile and do the exact same thing because after all, that was what was successful in the past. That was made us great. There will either be too many or too few features, and this is a really difficult one because there is no right answer. If you take all of the features that you had on the computer side of things and you try to cram them all into a smartphone app or a smartphone website, it's going to be way too crowded and people won't be able to figure it out. On the other hand, if you strip out a whole bunch of features to make the smartphone thing easier, your power users are going to complain bitterly because the features that they love are inevitably the ones that you've stripped out of there. So what do? You have to do this very careful balancing where you say, okay, what are the features that we have to make most prominent? And we'll put those up front. What are the things that are going to be most used by just power users, and we'll bury those further down because usually the power users are able to go and find those things. But it's a really complex thought process that a lot of companies are just kind of skipping past when they do mobile. We also see cases where they're just broken features, things that don't work when you go over to mobile, and the companies involved don't realize that it's happening. So I want to give you an example. This is with permission from one of our customers. This is a PC education site. So this is a company that does a whole bunch of educational video content online. And this is just a captive screenshot from a piece of their web purchasing process. And what they do when they sell is they've got monthly subscriptions and then monthly premium subscriptions. And so what's the difference between monthly subscription and monthly premium? Well, you hover over it, and exactly what you would expect to happen on the PC happens. You get this little tooltip that pops up and says, well, the premium subscriptions have exercise files and you can follow along and stuff like that. So that's great. If you're still confused, there's a link that says compare plans, and you click on that and you get this nice flash table that pops up with all the different check marks and all the stuff you'd expect. So a really nice, rich, well-engineered, carefully worked out checkout process that has been developed over the years and really works well. Let me show you now what happened when they took this across to mobile. So this is real video from a test.
There was a premium.
No tooltips, no table for comparison.
And then annual premium, annual. So I'm wondering, what is premium?
Monthly premium. Now, what is monthly premium? I mean, $25 a month to start, because I don't know what premium is. I know like a lot of these ones have a premium thing. I don't know what premium even is. There's no information here. It's just like dink, dink, dink. What is what? Where's the information in these?
Yeah, so really, really frustrating. And what went on here was, it's very logical if you think about it from the point of view of the developer. They said, okay, we've got our process, and we can't do the Flash thing, and we can't do tooltips, but otherwise this works really well, let's just put it there. And it just completely broke down for the users. But it wasn't visible to the company when they did it because they were so caught up in the way their site currently worked that they couldn't see how it was going to create problems. And what's really frustrating is this is people getting stuck right at the point of purchase, the last place where you want them to have hesitations. Okay, so what do you need to do about this? Well, the first thing is you've got to learn the mobile paradigm. That is really hard for an existing computer development group to do. The best practice that we're seeing in developers is they set up a separate team that just works on mobile full-time. And in fact, we know some companies that have a separate iOS team and a separate Android team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, usually when we talk to our clients about this stuff, they get really horrified because they don't have enough resources to do that. So at a minimum, what you need is you need a product manager who really knows mobile and is full-time mobile and can then harangue everybody else about what they don't understand about what's going on in the mobile space. Second thing, separate what you do from how you do it. Best example of this is look at what Windows did with Windows Mobile, Windows Phone. For a long time, Microsoft focused on trying to take the entire Windows experience and cram it into a phone. You even had a little start menu and stuff like that. They didn't really start to get traction until they threw that all out and they created this new version that was entirely designed around touchscreens and mobility. The problem is by the time they did it, Apple and Android had built up so much momentum that it was probably too late for them, and they continue to struggle today. Third thing is break down your application. What do people most need to do when they are mobile? And make those things the most prominent, even if they're not the most prominent thing on your desktop site. In some cases, it may be better to do a series of rifle shot applications rather than one big thing that's trying to do everything. If you look at what Facebook is doing going forward, it looks like they're starting to try to do different sorts of rifle shots. And then finally, and this is a piece of advice that goes back to when I was at Palm, you want to focus on the mainstream 80% of your users. The top 20%, the people who are the noisiest, the ones you will hear from the most online, are usually people who will demand too many features, and especially in a smartphone setting where you've got limited screen real estate and limited resources, they will force you to over-design the application or the website to the point where it's not usable by a typical person. It's better to design for the middle and then find ways to mollify the people at the high end. Put those features a couple level down or something like that. Now, this is a really tricky balance to hit, and it varies some depending on what you're creating. If you've got a game application that monetizes by selling just to the top 10% of users, then probably you want to change your priorities. But for most websites and applications, we recommend focusing on the 80%. Okay, so that's the legacy. Let me talk about the second problem, which is creating fear in the minds of your users. What we're finding is that people are more afraid of using smartphones than they are of using desktop computers. And this is probably because of several reasons. One is just the whole ecosystem is more complicated, and so they're afraid that somewhere in there they're going to be attacked by hackers. Think about it. On a smartphone, you've got a handset company, you've got a separate OS vendor, in most cases, you've got a carrier, and you've got an app developer. And when something goes wrong, what happens? Everybody points at everybody else, and the users understand that. It makes them feel insecure. Second fear is accidentally opting in. So this is, those things that you're supposed to check off to get on mail lists or things like that. We're finding a lot of customers hesitate before they check on those, or they hesitate on just doing a transaction because they're afraid they haven't been given full disclosure. And the fact is, a lot of cases, people designing mobile sites have simplified that disclosure down to the point where it's not really there anymore, and the users are starting to notice this. There have been a lot of complaints to the government, which is why the FTC is going around now to conferences like this and warning people that they're going to start suing companies if they don't do the right sort of disclosure. So it's a pretty serious situation. And then the third one, which was the biggest surprise to me, was fear of automatic social posts. If I do something with this app or this website, what is it going to stick on Facebook, and what exactly is going to happen to me? We see that a lot in tests. People will say things like, well, I'm not going to mark that like or dislike because I have no idea what the implications are of doing that. Or as soon as I'm done with the test, I'm going to go check on Facebook to see what it posted. Or even if something sounds like it's maybe a social feature, like we saw an app that had something called social choices, and what they actually meant was these are the most popular choices, but because of the word social, we saw a lot of people hesitating because they were afraid that was going to link back to their social media somehow. A good example of this in operation is this application called Sitter Squat by the guys who did Charmin bathroom tissue. So Greg Noodleman's been pointing this out, and I thought it was such a great example. So this is an app for rating public bathrooms. You can go and kind of log, you've got GPS, right? So you can get the location. You can take a picture of the bathroom. You can post all this stuff. Hey, good to visit, or no, stay away, keep driving, that sort of stuff. So, and what they've got here, the screen that I'm showing you here, is where it says log in with Facebook. So, now, given what I've told you about people fearing inadvertent social posts, what do you think users see when they see that log in with Facebook note there, right? It's like, so every time I go to the bathroom, is it going to be posted up on Facebook? And as we know, for some Facebook users, that would be like, cool, okay, that's great. But for a lot of other people, it really makes them hesitate. And more to the point, I don't think that's what the Charmin people wanted to happen. So you need to disclose what you're going to be doing with that social login if you're asking for that sort of login. So what do we do? Number one, if you're going to be asking people to make a purchase, you should put trust marks in the site. Trust marks are those little logos that we used to have in the early days of the web that said, this site has been audited to make sure that there's nothing nefarious going on with it. We stopped doing that on the web years ago because people trust websites a lot better than they used to. We need to do this on mobile because people don't trust us yet. Second, display the opt-ins very prominently. So if you're going to be opting into a mail list or something like that, you need to be able to have that control and don't go hide it down in some subsidiary screen. And then finally, give absolute social clarity. Let them know if you're going to post, or tell them you're not going to post so that they won't be afraid of pushing a button. Okay, so that's fear. Next, I want to talk about creating confusion in the minds of your customers, and we see this one a lot. There are many different ways that people go wrong when they're developing mobile stuff. A simple one is text that's just too small. A lot of engineers are about age 25. They've got really, really acute close-in vision, and so 4-point type on a smartphone looks okay to them. And then we do the test, and you get users doing this sort of thing, trying to bring it into focus. Low contrast. It's very trendy in the art world today to do light gray text on a white background or dark gray text on a black background. When you bring that across to a mobile device, the problem is people go out in the sun and the stuff fades out. So actually you need higher contrast on a mobile device than you would normally do on a personal computer. A lot of companies don't realize that. Another one is just unusable design elements, and one of my favorites is the slider. Sliders are wonderful. They look really, really great. You can put a whole bunch of them onto a screen. People understand how to use them. The problem is when you give them more than about 5 or 6 numbers that they're trying to determine in that slider. So from 0 to 6 works. But we saw the case of a ticket selling company that was using a slider to select the price of the tickets. Now what happens at a typical concert, right? You have $20 seats. They're up in the nosebleed session at the back of the arena. And then you have the $20,000 package, which is come backstage, get drunk with the band all night, and other stuff like that. Okay? And that's all offered on a single continuum with a slider. Now the problem is we got to put the human finger in there to show you how that operates relative to that slider. I have seen tests in which literally a person is trying to roll their finger across by 1 pixel at a time. So like they're trying to pick a $75 ticket and it's like, oh, damn, 90. Oh, 45. Oh, no, come on. No. It just doesn't work. I know the selectors that let you choose more discrete numbers, like the little scrolly things up and down, take up more space and they don't look as pretty. However, they have one advantage. They actually work. The sliders don't, except in very special cases. We also see cryptic buttons and text that people cannot figure out. Slow response, where you tap on something and the device doesn't respond immediately. Lack of help, and this is a really important one. When people get stuck in a computer website, the first thing they do is they look for tooltips. They move the mouse around and hover over things to see if some information will pop up. You can't hover on a smartphone or a tablet. So instead, the first thing that users instinctively do is they look for a help function when they get confused. If the help function is there, they can usually find it and get back to work and things will go great. If the help function is not there, they go completely off the rails. So it's a big problem. Another one we see a lot is just unintuitive success path. A design where they don't understand what they're supposed to do and they just look at it and go, oh, what's going on here? A lot of this stuff comes down to a trade-off between beauty and productivity. It seems like, based on the stuff that we're seeing, a lot of companies are designing first to have an absolutely gorgeous looking website or mobile app, and then they're trying to figure out how to make it usable. And I want to suggest that we need to switch around our values. Design it first to make it usable, and then figure out how to make that design pretty, rather than the other way around. So let me give you an example of some of the ways that people get stuck.
Go to the next task, create a gem to save this information. So I'm going to create, I'm assuming that's create a gem.
So they're saying create a gem, but it says add data.
Add data. Now, does that add the title of the gem or the data that I want saved?
I guess I'd have to go back to connections, share. Oh, is that little symbol a share? Let me go back. Did I not understand this? Let's see. Is this a share? Looks like a refresh. Looks like a refresh symbol, not a share symbol.
Yeah, and the icons aren't labeled, which is another big no-no. So that actually is a refresh symbol, but that's a refresh symbol on Android. This guy is using iOS. So he is completely crossed up between the iconography, the different iconography of the different platforms. And in fact, except for a couple of basic examples, the icon set in iOS and Android tends to be very different. Now, what you can say is, well, maybe just for each, if I'm doing an application, I'll just stick with the iconography for that particular operating system, and that's a good start. However, you get people who still get confused by the crossover between them. It's a complete mess if you're trying to do a website. So actually, the best practice is to just label your frickin' icons or just use text if you have to. What's happening is the icons are just kind of canceling each other out in a lot of cases in the minds of customers. So what do we want to do? First of all, functionality is the highest form of beauty. That's the ethic that I think we need to be setting. It's not that you should make ugly sites or apps, but functionality first. Second, avoid this confusing UI stuff. When in doubt, use text, label the icons. Avoid multi-level menus. Because of time, I cut this out, but there's a whole example we have of somebody struggling through a 3-level menu system. Please don't do that to users. It's not a nice thing to do. Another one is just to respond instantly. The moment that somebody taps a button, the app should do something, even if it's just a piece of gratuitous animation. Because if you don't do that, what they'll do is they'll go tap, 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 tap. They probably will crash the application. Even if they don't, they'll get completely confused about what's going on. So instant response of some sort. And then finally, great help. And by that I mean help that is always accessible and ideally should be context sensitive and searchable. Although those are options, the big thing is always having it available. A couple of examples of how to do it right. WebMD is a really interesting application. I encourage you to check it out if you haven't. When you start up WebMD, it says, hey, do you want to take a tour? Just right at the start. And if you take it, what they do is it's just one of those static screen swipey things that you go through. But what they've done is they've taken the main screens of the application and they've just put in static tooltips. We can't hover and do tooltips, so they just drew that stuff in. Those are just static screens, but it tells you how to use the different elements in the interface. Now, ideally, something they haven't done, but I wish they had, if they made that re-accessible from every place in the application, then that would be enough. That would be fine. And what we see users doing is sometimes they say, gee, I wish I could go back to the tutorial right now because this is the time that I'm confused. So let them get back to the frickin' tutorial. Another beautiful example. So this is something called Snapseed. It's a photo editing application, and this is a very typical mobile interface, right? Unlabeled icons, cryptic stuff. It looks really pretty, but good luck figuring out what you're supposed to do with it. The saving grace of this app is it's a little hard to see, but in the upper left-hand corner, there's a question mark icon. You tap the question mark, and look what happens. The screen grays out. You get a white overlay that explains what every one of those icons does. That's pretty cool. Didn't make you compromise the beauty of the interface or anything like that, but we told the user here's an easy way to be able to get information on what you're supposed to be doing with this application. So that's confusion. Let me talk about the fourth trap, which is creating boredom. So let's face it, doing mobile is kind of like running a birthday party for 4-year-olds. You have to keep them constantly occupied, very short attention span. They're constantly running around doing different things. When somebody's using, especially a smartphone, there's lots of other stuff they could be doing. They're usually on the go, or they're in a situation where they're impatient. They could go check Facebook, or they could play a game, or there are lots of other stuff they could get to. If they don't feel like they're making progress, if they don't feel like they're being rewarded in some way, they will tend to bolt off to something else, and they simply won't stick around. So top turnoffs that we see, they just don't understand the point of the application. It's too hard to learn it. There may be too many social prompts. So this is not things that say link to Facebook. This is, hey, do you want to tell your friends on Facebook how you're doing? And you ask them once, and that's kind of okay. Ask them twice, and it's irritating. Ask them 3 times, and they may throw the smartphone at somebody. Either too many or too few controls. And this is another case where it's really hard to hit the right balance because somebody is always going to want an additional control. And then the other case we see is just apps that are boring and just don't engage people emotionally. And let me actually give you an example of what that sounds like. One of the things I like about this sort of test is it's really easy to tell when the users are bored. Yeah. Bad sign.
I am not sure. 9 lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So is that all those things? Well, anyway, let's spin. See what happens. I'm not sure exactly what I'm doing here.
Another pause.
Okay, so that costs me $2.25.
Basically with that, I was just kind of bored. Just the same thing repetitively, and there didn't seem to be any change in it. The levels changed, but all that really did was make me lose my money a little faster.
Yeah. So what I like about this is, even if this was in a foreign language, you'd be able to tell exactly what's going on just by tone of voice and stuff like that. And it's really nice if you pair this sort of stuff with analytics. You can go back and forth between emotional and then rational analysis of what's happening. So here's what tends to happen sometimes in the design process is a lot of us are still captive of the way you're supposed to do web apps in the personal computer world. And what you're supposed to do there is you're supposed to ship this really embarrassingly primitive version of your website. Ship early, ship often, right? I'm sure you've heard that phrase. And then what happens is you look at the logs, you look at the analytics, find out where you're losing people, you make a little theory about why that's going on, you fix it really quick, and then you watch the analytics and you just kind of iterate really, really, really fast, and you can kind of evolve a good website out of that. Here's what happens when you do that in mobile, especially mobile apps. You ship an embarrassingly primitive version of your application. It goes up on the App Store and immediately gets trashed with a bunch of one-star reviews. Nobody wants to use it as a result. You desperately try to fix it, but by then the users have moved on. And usually the company comes back and says, well, mobile just was not a good match for our business. And so we really should focus on other stuff. And it's not actually that at all. It's that they came at mobile in the wrong place because they treated it like a PC website. And that's where the mistake is. So what should you do? Well, the first thing is don't only test for usability. You want to test for emotional engagement as well. It's really getting a good balance of quant and qual. And you want to test before you ship. If the PC web world is ship early, ship often, the mobile world is test early, test often prior to shipment. So I want to talk about how to avoid the traps. Because of time, I won't show you this video, but this is Evernote talking about the way that they use our stuff. The big point that I want you to get out of that they said is you can use this stuff to understand how users think, not just what they're doing. And that's something, whether you're using our service or somebody else's, I want you to find ways to get inside the heads of users, especially in mobile because their behavior is different from what you may expect it to be based on your experience. So what do I want you to remember? Number one, rethink your app and your flow for mobile. Think through what people are going to want to do in a mobile setting. Second, design for that mainstream 80% in most cases rather than the noisy 20%. When in doubt about the understandability of elements in your interface, use text rather than or in addition to icons. Avoid multi-level menus. Next, make it work and then make it pretty. Next one is respond instantly. When somebody taps something, you should show an immediate response to it. Give superb help that's available all the time. Show them that they're safe. Give them trust marks or something like that so they won't be afraid of hackers. Avoid social anxiety by saying exactly what you're going to do if you use Facebook login or something like that. By the way, it's okay to use Facebook login, but just give them a little note that says we're not going to post to Facebook. We're just using this for login. And then finally, test early and test often prior to shipment. Okay, so if you want to do a free test on our site, you just go to it and use the code usertestme. There's a white paper that talks about this. A lot of times feedback I get is, well, Mike, I know these things, but I can't convince my clients. Okay, so there's a white paper you can hand to the clients to explain to them why this stuff is needed. And that's the address to get to that. My mail address is mike@usertesting.com. If you didn't get these URLs or anything else, or if you have other questions, I'd love to hear from you. Seriously, I'd love to get feedback and stuff like that. With that, how much time do we have left here? Oh, I'm totally out. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we'll conclude it here. Mike@usertesting.com if you want to get in touch. I will go outside and take questions out there if anybody has any questions. Thank you so much for your time.